Okay, good morning, everybody. And thank you all so much for joining us today. This is a special session, a focus session. Thank you, first of all, to the Kinus for giving us this opportunity to do this. We're very, very excited. And we'd like to welcome everybody to our session, which is called Was is an Aleph. And this session is going to be led by Rabbi Jacobson, the founder and the dean of the Meaningful Life Center. And his claim to fame, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that he was a Heiser for the Rebbe for so many years. We'll speak a little bit more about that afterwards. But to begin, welcome again, and we'd like to share something with you to introduce our session. So please pay attention and watch your screen. Thank you.
Und das erzählt, abischaft der alte Rebbe hat genommen in am Land für seinen Sohn für den Mitteln Rebbe. Hat herangerufen, der alte Rebbe, für sich herangerufen, ein junger Mann, und hat ihm gesagt, der alte Rebbe soll auszureden mit Amiden. Und der Schlerer, der hat gesagt, Beniden hat er durch. Und sie hat dann gesagt, der alte Rebbe, dem jungen Mann, als du hast ein Mitzwe von Sonne und Farne in den Beisei, und ich habe ein Mitzwe, die Finanzen Levonecho. Nur wir arbeiten ein Mitzwe für ein Mitzwe, ich habe dir geben. Als Sonne und Adea, du sollst kommen sein, Sonne und Farne in den Beisei, und du wirst lernen mit meinem Ingo. Der junge Mann war weggegangen, danach hat er gesagt, was steht da, Kluger in Gemeinde, hat mir ja schon gelernt, er darf noch etwas dabei wollen. Er hat gekommen, danach zu gehen zum alten Reden und sagt, Mele, das, was mir sagt, da sehe ich mir gern auf Sonne und Farne mit mir Beisei, was ich darf gern. Mir sagt, ihr soll lernen mit Eier Ingo, dass ihr sich wissen, wie zu lernen. Denn der alte Rebbe geändert, dass jeden Richten noch lernen den Allensee. Was ist ein Alles? Assim telefonei. Assim telefonei. Was ist ein Alles? I wish to name, I wish to know a castle in the Shamayim and the Grossies and others. Und mit der noch eine Weile gewesen, als ich noch einen Ayut zu leben, ist das die Schone, und Ayut zu nutzen, ist das der Guff, und der Castle in the Shamayim, was du doch der und das Tag. Und das ist ein neues, das ist der Unheil und neue
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Hanala, for doing all these technological things for us. We very much appreciate it. So we have heard from the Rebbe himself exactly what we have to know and what we have to do in order to know how to teach every single Jewish person that we meet. So to introduce the session and our speaker, I want to just say again that the theme of our talk is Was is an Aleph, 5 Hasidic pedagogic principles that will not only transform the way we prepare and present adult education classes, but they will also change entirely the way that people receive these classes. And it all begins with the Aleph. And very briefly to outline, what are these 5 principles? So we have one that I will say it in several different ways, but this is the gist of it. The Rebbe teaches us, our Rabbeim teach us that it is empowerment versus information, methodology versus facts, character development versus data. That is all one point. The second point we'll be speaking about is that it's the big picture that informs all the details of the Torah, which means that it's mission-driven versus action-driven. It means there is unity to everything that we teach and do and live with. The third point will be that we have to get to the root versus the symptoms, and the concept of prevention before having to remediate and to fix things. The fourth point is, of course, this is all not in any specific order, is relevancy. That is really probably one of the most important things, that everything we teach has to be relevant. And the last point that we'll touch upon in Mirz Hashem is about empathy, emotional intelligence and health, and soulfulness. And to give us a little bit of a picture of all of this, I asked my husband, Rabbi Simon Jacobson, to share this with us from all of his years of working with the Sichos of the Rebbe and writing the Hanachas and having something that I think is probably the most invaluable gift that anyone could ever have, which was having a direct line to the Rebbe when he was working on the Sichos, asking numerous questions about these different things that Rebbe spoke about and how to write them down for eternity. So I'm very, very grateful to him for agreeing to join us this morning. And please welcome Rabbi Simon Jacobson.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you all, shluches, nashim tzidkanios of our generation, leaders in your communities, and especially to speak about such a fundamental topic, which is chinuch, education, which is essentially the foundation of everything. As we just heard in the Rebbe's own words with the Nigun, that the Alter Rebbe said 7 generations ago, and now the Rebbe said in his own Nigun, the same Nigun, Vos is an Aleph, that an Aleph, which means more than just the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, is the Aleph of everything. And the Alter Rebbe, in a very succinct and brief way, told that Melamed, that taught the Mittler Rebbe, the Yesod, the foundation and the basis of all education. And you see from the words that he said, that was is an Aleph, he said, Ayud von neben, Ayud von unten, and a kav that connects them. And then he said, Ayud, an Eibishter von neben, God above. And Ayid, the Yud Lamata below, is the Jew below. Maybe you should mute everybody if you don't mind. And the Yud below is the Jew below, and the Kav, the line that connects in the Aleph, is the Yiras Shamayim. And it comes out in an actual image that we could all envision. However, it's obvious that this short statement carries within it many, many dimensions and many details. So in my own work, I determined at some point how to spell this out in actual principles. We can take this point of the Aleph and infuse it in the way we educate. And when I say educate, I mean educate every person, including our children, and of course our constituents, the adult education. But the truth is this applies to every form of education. And I believe that once we understand it well, we wouldn't even call it education anymore. It's much more than education. It's shaping lives, shaping a life to be able to achieve what it has to achieve in this world. And all that is encompassed, as I said, in the Aleph that the Alter Rebbe said, Vos is an Aleph. So obviously there are much more than 5 principles. There can be many, but to make it somewhat manageable, the 5, as Shady just spelled them out. So let's begin with the first one. The first one is empowerment. This isn't a small matter. The Rebbe, one of the most favorite statements of the Rebbe, if you can call it a favorite, was in Parsha Ba'alescha. In the beginning of Ba'alescha, Rashi asks the question, Why does it say Bahaloisches Hanedis? You shall raise the flames. It should say Bahadlokescha. You shall kindle the flames. Why Bahalescha? You ignite, you light, you kindle flames. You don't raise them. And he answers, because the mitzvah was that when the Kohen Gadol would light the menorah, it wasn't just enough to kindle it. He had to make sure that it burned on its own. Ad shetehei shalheves eila me'eleha. You know, it takes a split second when you light a flame for it to catch. He could not go to the next one until he saw it catch. The Rebbe asked the question, why is that so significant? You have to change an entire word in the Torah. So what's the worst scenario? It burns out, and then he goes back and lights it again. Says the Rebbe, no. This one word changes our whole approach. In life, we are neiros lahoyer. We are all meant to be menorahs, walking menorahs that kindle flames. The Neir Hashem Nishmas Adam, the soul of every human being. With Ner Mitzvah v'Teireh, with the flame of a mitzvah, the candle of a mitzvah, and the light of Teireh. So the Teireh is telling us, with this one change, it's not enough to light and illuminate someone. It's not enough to ignite them. You have to make sure that they maintain it and sustain it, even when you're not there any longer, they continue to burn. And that's the difference. If you teach someone data, information, knowledge, it's beautiful, a lot of information. You even teach them and you answer questions they may have. Okay, but can they answer their questions when the teacher is no longer there? Can they live a life and find their own resources? Obviously, we always need teachers and mentors. So empowerment was the key. And look at the Rebbe himself, a living example. What greater teacher than the Rebbe? What did the Rebbe do? Look now, it's 26 years after Gimel Tammuz. There are thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Talmidim that are each in their own location, including each one of you and your husbands, are teaching people. And even though the Rebbe is not physically speaking, but he taught us how to teach, not just how to learn. So the first lesson is empowerment. When the Alter Rebbe said, "What is an Aleph?" The Yud L'Maila and the Yud L'Mata, that was empowerment. He was saying that everything in education is about connecting, and every person can connect. It doesn't say that one person connects you. Yad Yid, L'Mata, every Jew below is connected. And through what? Through Yiras Shamayim. So what Chassidus does, and this is what we're going to do through all these principles, is more than just education. People always ask the question, so what does Chassidus add? We know Chassidus contributed. What does it add to education? How does a Chassidus shemachanech or mechaneches, a shliach or shlucha, teach differently than another person would be a teacher? And not to take away from anyone. And the answer is, it's the kav of Yiras Shamayim, that we are empowering people to discover the strengths that God invested in them. They indeed need to be taught and trained, but ultimately they're a flame that rises on its own. And every person has that neshama, and every person has that direct connection to the Yud L'Maila. And that's the first of the 5 principles of Vases on Aleph.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we will go to the second principle, which will discuss the big picture and how Chassidus teaches us how to use this for the best education that we can share with people.
So here too, you have 2 approaches to anything that you teach. You can teach people details. You start with Bereishis Bara Elokim, you learn Rashi, you learn the commentaries. You can teach a Shulchan Aruch Halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. You can teach Tanakh, Jewish history. I mean, there are many things you can teach. The Torah, Baruch Hashem, is Arucha Me'eretz Midah Rechava Miniyah. It's wide and vast, infinite, so. And a multitude of ideas and books and Sfarim. I mean, there's just the Chav Dalet Sifrei Kodesh, 24 Sfarim of Tanakh. And then you have the whole Mishnah and Gemara. And then you have all the Rabbanon Savaroi, and you have the Goenim, and the Rishenim, and the Poskim, and the Achreinim. I mean, it's literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Sfarim, millions of pages. So anyone who starts to learn can learn a very important detail, but sometimes doesn't know what the big picture is. That's a fact. I talked to many people who are actually lomdim in Torah. And when I say, what's the bottom line? What's the punchline? Not everybody could answer that question. So Hillel, when he was asked by the potential convert, teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot, and mention should be made that Shammai rejected him. He told him, you can't do that. Learning Torah requires time. You can't stand on one foot and learn the whole Torah. And Hillel answered in the reverse of V'ahavta kamecha, Mada olach soni lechavercha lesavi. V'ahavta kamecha is that klal gadol b'Torah in the words of Rabbi Akiva. But still, what Chassidus introduces is how we see in the Torah the central points. Everyone who went to Chassidish school knows, no matter whether they're a scholar or not scholar, that the Eibishter created the world, Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyisleis Baruch Dira B'Tachtein. And that informs everything. Every detail is informed by that. It's a very different education when you go details, and you don't know that bigger picture. Every master, teacher, in any school of thought, what you really see is not just they're wise, not just they know a lot, but they know the entire picture. They know what we're talking about here. Again, so when the Alter Rebbe said, "Vos is an Aleph," he didn't just say an Aleph is the beginning of Aleph base. An Aleph captures the whole picture. There's God above, there's the human being below, and there's a Yerushalayim that connects them. When that infuses every detail, you have a very different type of education. In the Chassidish Chinuch, both in our own schools and how we teach in classes, so in addition to the first point of empowerment, you have to always make sure, not every minute when you teach, but you have to always make sure in the beginning of a class or the beginning of a series that you explain, what are we going to cover? What is the goal here? And should always come down to, in addition to empowerment, that we are coming to the takeaway message is going to be how each of us are charged by God with a mission to transform this world, to make a dira b'tachtein, to come into this world and do something with our skills. Now we'll talk the details, how you do it, which mitzvah, and so on. So that's why we always begin, when the Eden left Mitzrayim, they asked Hashem, tell us your mitzvahs, what do you want us to do? They were just freed from Mitzrayim, and they wanted to fulfill what God wants of them. There's a mechilta, a very fascinating mechilta. The Medrash says, that Hashem says, not so fast. Before you accept my mitzvahs, I want you kablu malchusai. Va'achar kach kablu gzeresai. First accept me in my entirety, my sovereignty. When I know you accept me as your God, then I know that automatically you'll also do everything you can to fulfill my specific interests, my specific laws, my specific guidelines. This is such a tremendous lesson. That's why we have Kabbalah Sel Machal Shamayim before Kabbalah Sel Mitzvahs, Shema Yisrael, and then we go into the details. Not because the details aren't vital, but when they're infused, when they are informed by what is the meaning of it all, then it's a very different story. So we'll always begin from a klal to a prat. The klal is the overriding purpose of it all, the overriding picture. And that also focuses on the element that we're not just about do this, do that, keep Shabbos, eat kosher, taras mishpacha, all the other mitzvahs. The mitzvahs are all ratzon ha'elyon. This is God's desire for you to fulfill the mission for which you were charged. How you fulfill the mission is the details. But first you need to know there's a mission. And here again, you'll see quite often people teach and people go away, so what is my mission? You know the details, but the big picture. And that obviously also is another connector from Eben Bizunten, the Kava Machaber, from heaven to earth, because God gave us a mission. And the way we connect this through our Yerushalayim means, again, a general thing, Kabul Malchusai, that we accept the yoke of heaven, we accept that responsibility. And then that in turn informs detail by detail as we go through our lives. This is something that is so vital. I find in my own classes when I teach, when I include that element, and I always make sure to do it, people come away with a far different look at things. They don't just see, okay, I learned a nice thought, an inspirational idea. They see us part of a bigger picture, a bigger horizon. And there's nothing like standing on top of a mountain and seeing the bird's eye view. So when we learn about from the beginning of time when Adam and Chava were created, and then history rolls on, and we're part of one larger narrative, that our lives today in Tafshin Pei Aleph in 2021 is not in a vacuum. It comes as a long marathon from the beginning of time, and that we are standing on the shoulders of those before us. And there's a shtalshus, there's a shalshelis, a chain. That changes so much, because no matter who you are, you're not alone. You're part of a big picture. You're part of history. You're part of generations. And even when you don't feel you have the strength, but you're getting strength, the cumulative strength of all those that came before us, the Mesiras Nefesh of their parents and grandparents and all the prices they paid. And here we are finishing the final last steps to bring us to the Geula, which again is big picture. What is the Geula? The purpose of creation. God said, I want a dira b'tachtenim. Mashiach is the fulfillment and realization of that dira b'tachtenim, that you see Gilead Lakus, Lamato, in the words of the Rambam, at the end of the Rambam, Mola Oretz Deis Hashem Kamayim Layom Chasim. So we're here about changing the world, not just changing individuals. However, obviously, the big picture has to be then translated into the small picture. You can't just think about the vision. The vision needs to be implemented. And that comes down to day-by-day activities that are empowered and energized and informed by that bigger picture.
Thank you so much. Okay, so now we move on to another point, which is how we deal with education. We have to get to the root versus the symptoms. We have to do the preventive versus the remedial. So what does Chassidus teach us about this?
I'll begin with a point that the Rebbe very often would make, and in many, many specific situations. In simple English, the best defense is offense. This was part of the Rebbe's approach in everything. He didn't wait till a problem arose. He anticipated. And obviously, when you're informed by the big picture and your objective is empowerment, you think in those terms, because you think not about, okay, here's a problem, let me put out a fire. We all know when it comes to medicine, there's remedial medicine and there's preventive medicine. There's dealing with a symptom or a root. Person has a headache, God forbid, you take an Advil or whatever it is a person takes. You have, let's say, a small little bruise, you put on a Band-Aid. Now, in many situations, that's perfectly fine when it's a superficial issue. Same thing emotionally and psychologically, there's a challenge. You try to address it in the short term. But we all know, especially deeper issues, and everybody has deeper issues, then it's not enough just to put on a Band-Aid or to take a painkiller. You need to do something on the root level. The same is true in chinuch and in ruchnius. You know, it's true we can basically, God forbid, be lax with the education of our children. And then when there's a problem, we'll deal with it. But we all know once there's a problem, it's much, much harder to deal with. Just like any issue. An infection, you want to nip it in the bud. You don't want to wait till it grows. So what does this mean in an educational system, an educational approach, especially with any form of education, but we're focusing on adult education? It means you want to teach people not just what the issue is, but what is the root of the issue. So someone once came to the Rebbe in Yechidus. This is more than one story like this. And it was a shalom bias issue between husband and wife. And the Rebbe listened to both of them patiently. Each one gave their list of complaints about the other. Obviously, the Rebbe didn't say this, but it was clear from what he guided them that usually the problems you articulate are not the real problems. Those are the symptoms. The real problem, either people are not even aware of, or they don't speak about because they don't want to go there to the focus, to the root. They'll find a detail. So the Rebbe asked them a simple question. He said, do you spend time together learning, taking a walk, or doing other things? So the wife says, no, I don't want to be with him, especially when he behaves in this way. And the husband gave his excuses. What was the story? That in other words, your essential connection, I mentioned Kabul Malchusa, your essential connection is being compromised. And you need to spend time on being with each other, and that automatically will make it easier to deal with other things. They refused. They were obstinate. So, but the Rebbe said, so you come to me, you're asking me for advice, I'm giving you advice, you're not ready to listen. So obviously out of Kabbalah Sale, they listened, and it actually helped their situation. But they were refusing to go there because they were so focused on the moment. They couldn't go back and step back and say, 1 second, we have to go back to where all this begins. It's a small example. In every Indian, every idea that you teach and educate, you can teach about, here's the specific issue. Let's talk about what it's supposed to be like. Let's say Shabbos. Take Shabbos, for example. So Shabbos, everyone knows, it's a beautiful day. 6 days of the week you work. And Shabbos, you have menucha. What's menucha? That you don't get immersed in material activities. You focus on your family, on learning, on davening, on learning. You spend more time on a ruchniisdika level. Now, for many people, Shabbos is like almost a relief. What's the relief? I'm exhausted after 6 days, so I'm going to rest. Now, you could say, what's wrong with that? Well, I'll tell you something. There's nothing wrong with that. Every Jew and every person deserves rest, and everyone deserves menucha. But let's talk about our children for a moment. So I remember once a woman calling me. She called me. I didn't know who it was. She said to me, I have a 7-year-old boy. He refuses to come to the Shabbos table. Stays in his room. What can I do? So I said to him, why doesn't he want to come to the table? I don't know. He just doesn't want to come. I said, what's going on at your table? She said, the same usual every week, the same thing. I said, every week the same thing? Yeah. My husband comes home from shul. He bickers a bit. He makes kiddush. Falls asleep at the same place. Sings the same nigunim. We have more or less the same food, not exactly the same food, the same recipes. So I said, why would a 17-year-old boy who's young and energetic be interested in coming to a Shabbos table like that? She says, what the Eibishter said, Shabbos, it's a beautiful day. I said, yeah, I understand, but does he appreciate that? What should I do, she said. I'll tell you what to do, I said. If husband works in the city, yeah. Why doesn't he invite a few secular Jews? I don't know if you can call them secular Jews, but Jews who do not yet know what Yiddishkeit is. Invite even an atheist or two and have a good argument at the table about God. Make it alive. Every Shabbos should be coming alive. Shabbos is not just a day of doing nothing. How many people have told me, I'm not interested in Shabbos. Why? I do nothing. I can't wait till Shabbos is over. That's a perfect example of Shabbos on its surface level. When you get to the root of Shabbos, Shabbos is a day when everything goes back to its purest form. It's the most exciting day if you make it so. Chassidus teaches you that Shabbos is not just a day of doing nothing, it's a day of doing everything instead of working and so on. Now, of course, you need to learn Chassidus to do that. But that's an example of taking a mitzvah and focusing on its remedial side or focusing on its deeper neshama. A different way of putting it, instead of focusing on the guf, on the body, you focus on the soul. The Rebbe said in the Sikha we just heard from Yud Shvat Tovshin Tazayin, Ayud Lamaila, Ayud Lamata is Eich the Taich and the Shama Lamaila and a Guf Lamata. The soul above and the body below, and you want to connect soul and body. Mitzvahs can be done, mitzvahs anoshim ulamoda in a very mechanical way. It can be done in a neshamadika way, which we'll talk about some more soon in the other principles. But regarding our discussion here, when you teach people how to address the root of an issue instead of its symptoms, it's a very different way of looking at things. And that's how Teda looks at everything. Teda doesn't begin, here's the problem, let's see how to fix it. Obviously, there's halachas that talk about that. It begins with initially creating a healthy human being, a healthy education, a healthy child, a healthy student that has an approach that comes from within, and automatically you can then deal with different particular symptoms. So that covers the root versus symptoms one, number 3, principle number 3.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now we come to a point that I personally find to be, it's just my own opinion, I think it's probably the most important thing, which is relevancy, because we can teach the most beautiful things in the world and create the most fantastic lessons and have the most beautiful things that'll come along with the lessons. But if the content, if the message is not relevant, then I don't believe that it will be internalized even by the most absorbent student. So what does Chassidus tell us about that?
Okay, so principle number 4. Since, as Shandi mentioned before, I had the schus to work on the Rebbe's Fabrengens, Biachoizer and Maniach. So I also had the opportunity, which I fully exploited, I should add, to ask the Rebbe questions. And I tried to ask about everything and anything that came my way. But obviously always had to connect it to a Sikha or to a Maimer. So at the time, it was in 1999, I think, Tovshin Mem Tes. 1989, Tovshin Mem Tes, 1989. So I was teaching Tanya then. And I decided to ask the Rebbe a question. You know, the whole Tanya, which is a Teresh B'Ksav of Chassidus, the Alter Rebbe wrote the Sharblat. The Sharblat, the Alter Rebbe himself wrote the cover page. And what does he say? That this Sefer, the Pisofim is Miyusad, is based on the Posik Ki Korev Elecha Hadover Me'ei Befichal Bovov Chalasese Levayet Hetev Echu Korev Me'ei Bederech Harucha Ktsara Be'ezus Hashem Yisbarach. The Sharblat, which of course doesn't come with every sefer you read. You don't always have the theme of the whole sefer right there on the cover page, especially written by the author. If you talk about an example of big picture informing small picture, the Alter Rebbe tells us what the big picture of Tanya is, what his goal with the whole Tanya, which really, by extension, is the goal of all of Chassidus. So understanding this, so the obvious question is, the Pasuk is a Pasuk in Parsha Nitzavim. Moshe Rabbeinu, at the end of his life, is telling the Eden, in the last 37 days, Sefer Dvarim, he's telling the Eden instructions. And one of the things he tells them, that you should know, Teira mitzvahs, dover, korav dover, Teira mitzvahs or tshuva, Bechlal talked about Yiddishkeit. You may think that it's going to be difficult to access. And he uses the three expressions, Lo b'shamayim hi, it's not in heaven, it's not across a wide sea, and and it's not distant. And then he concludes, Ki korav, rather, because korav elecha hadover me'ed befichel b'vav chalases. So what's missing in this pasuk that the Alter Rebbe felt the need to go write a Sefer Tanya that took him many, many years to write? What's missing in this? So I asked the Rebbe, because sometimes when you have to translate into English, it forces you to dig deeper into the content to understand its true significance. It's easy to say korav elecha, we just use the word korav elecha, which is just another, I'll talk about this shortly, another way of just saying things that you and I may know what we mean, but when you have to explain it to someone who doesn't know what the word means, you have no words. So I asked the Rebbe if you could translate korev. You know, most people translate korev, ki korev elecha is close. Not rochik, but korev. Not rechkeik, not me'ever liyam b'shamayim, korev, close. So I asked if you can translate it as relevance. And that's where this point comes from, relevance. And the Rebbe checked with a check and said yes. Because when you say close, what does it mean close? In physical proximity, that you're sitting there in Oren Kodesh? You could be sitting right near Torah physically and not necessarily relate to it. When you say relevant, it's a whole different meaning. It's relevant to you, to your life. So the Alter Rebbe said, yes, that Moshe Rabbeinu made the statement that it is relevant. And it's not something distant in the three different expressions he used. But eich hu korev me'ed, how is it relevant? There comes a whole Sefer Tanya, the Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah of Chassidus. And with that comes the Torah Shebal Peh of Chassidus, all the Maimorim from the Alter Rebbe to the Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, Rebbe Marash, Rebbe Rashab, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Rebbe, all coming to explain how is it relevant. Because that's one of the biggest challenges in life in general, and specifically in chinuch, in teaching. You can teach someone kol ha-Torah kula. They could be a gon and a baki b'shas, and every halacha and every iota, but they may say, you know what, it's an academic teaching. It's not relevant to me personally. Look at Parshas in the Torah. So a pasuk like v'haftarech kamecha, everyone understands its relevance. Lasei zdaka mishpat, clear. But what about Parshas Mitzvah? What about Parshas Azriya? What about 98% of Chumash? Read it, Pshuta Shamikra. Either it's not relevant today because it was only the time of the Beis Hamikdash, or it's talking about something that doesn't even exist, or something that is so seemingly foreign, which is why many people, when they learn Torah, the way they learned it in yeshiva or however they were taught in Hebrew school, Say, good, I heard the information. But relevance? Can you tell me the relevance of a mitzvah to my life? Can you tell me the relevance even of other psukim and so on? Comes Chassidus, and starting from Tanya says, no, these are not just concepts. These are not just archaic ideas that once happened. Each of them has a personal message and a relevant message that can change your life. So in many ways, this is the essence of it all. And the Alter Rebbe wrote a whole sefer, because relevance is not just for Eden, Tineke Shenishbu, who don't know Yiddishkeit. There for sure relevance is critical, because they're not yet interested. They have no idea what Shabbos is, what Kashrus is, what Yom Kippur is, what a mitzvah is. So by explaining that a mitzvah does not come from the word commandment, a mitzvah means connection. Oh, connection? What am I getting connected to? Everybody wants to be connected. And an Aveda doesn't mean a sin, it means a displacement, a disconnection. And you go through all the Torah and you use the way Chassidus infuses the neshama in each detail, it's a whole different Torah. It's a Torah that every letter is relevant to our lives. What is the most famous and the most repeated statement by the Rebbe in Farbrengens? So many people say, Hamaisu Eikir. Yeah, that's up there. That action is paramount. But even more than that is the words Torah, Meloshin, Heira'ah. The Rebbe sometimes repeated it more than 5-10 times in the same Farbrengen. So you could ask yourself, how many times you have to repeat? Everyone knows, Torah, Meloshin, Heira'ah. Because as much as you repeat it, you still need to live by that. The Torah is not a book of stories, God forbid, of laws, of history, even of inspiration. It's a guidebook. It's life's operator's manual. As the Medrash says, the Torah is a blueprint of creation. Istako baraisa or bara alma. The Eibishter looked into Torah, and with that he created the world. And kach barnash, that same thing, we look into this blueprint and we know how to live our lives to the best. So if someone even asks you, why should I learn Torah? So you say it's a mitzvah. Knowledge is power. But when you say to someone, you know what Torah is, it'll teach you how you tick, what makes you tick. It'll teach you what your soul is like, what your destiny is like, what your mission is. It'll teach you how to actualize all your skills and learn to serve a higher cause. It'll teach you how to be the happiest possible person. All those statements, that's relevant to me. If you just say Torah, I'm not saying some people are Kabbalah Selniks, they want to learn Torah because the Eibishter gave a Torah. No, Nasa Kedem Lenishma, Nasa Lenishma. But when you can explain the relevance, it changes the whole thing. But in addition, the Korvei Lech of the Alter Rebbe was not just for Taneka Shenishbu. It wasn't for people who don't know what Yiddishkeit is. Remember, when the Alter Rebbe wrote Tanya, his Chassidim, his Talmidim, the Tanya was written not for Taneka Shenishbu initially. It was written for big Chassidim as well. Yiras Shamayim, Tzadikim, Einanim. So what's the Korvei Lecha for a person who's already a Shemer Torah mitzvah? So the answer the Chassidus gives to that, one answer, is based on a Gemara in Brachos, which shows you the real power of relevance. What is that? The Gemara in Brachos says, "Is gamve apumachtarta rachmona karya." In Aramaic, translated from Aramaic, it means a ganef, a thief, a burglar. Before he goes out to steal, he prays to Hashem to help him and succeed. Now tell me, what does that mean? Doesn't that sound like someone that's insane? The Eibishter said, Nasar Sadibris, Loi Signev, do not steal. You're coming to the Eibishter and say, please help me do what you told me not to do. Mela, a person forgets, you could say a moment of forgetfulness. He ignores God, God forbid. He denies God. But to invite God and say, I'm going to pray to you to do something you told me not to do. So Chassidus answers because Amunah could be makif. He has true Amunah. He's praying to Hashem with sincerity. It's not a fake prayer. It's a real prayer. But his Amunah has not been internalized. It's not been integrated. It's not relevant. It's Amunah from a distance. We all have this. We believe many things. And not necessarily when it comes to acting, or we can give others advice that we ourselves don't follow so often. That's because it didn't integrate. It didn't penetrate the pnimius. But in other language, it's not Korevei Lecha. So the Alter Rebbe came to teach through Tanya, and all of Chassidus comes to teach, not just to do it, but recognize that every mitzvah is who you are, is the essence of who you are. And then when you do a mitzvah, you are actually connecting much more to who you are than when you do other things. And that changes everything. So I can tell you, in classes, any class you give, you must make it relevant. I'm not saying that as a command. First of all, the Alter Rebbe said, and that's the whole chassidus. But that's how you capture minds and hearts. Yes, some people will be interested in the academic element. Not denying that. I'm not suggesting not to do that. But every fabringen, every sikha of the Rebbe, how did it always conclude? Now that we learned a Rashi, or a Zohar, or Pirkei Yovis, or a Rambam, or a Siyum, and Shas, or whatever else the Rebbe spoke about, what's the lesson in our lives? So besides the fact that it makes it much geschmacker because there's a lesson, but it also tells you that this is relevant. It's not just you learned an abstract idea. What was so fascinating by the Rebbe, in the Rebbe Sichos, and really all of Chassidus, is it takes things that seem so beyond us and turns it into a practical, personalized, customized message to life in every area of life. When you can do that, when you do that, it changes the whole education process because it's not just about ideas. What would it do for our children, even our children going to our mosdos, when they would recognize the relevance to their personal lives of everything they learn? And it's not just an abstract or detached concept. So relevancy is principle number 4. And of course, connecting it to the Aleph, was is an Aleph, the Eibishter Lamaila, the Yid Lamata, Yid Shamayim, because the whole point is connecting the two. That it's not just an Eibishter sending commands to us below, but there's a chibur, a connection. Chassidus talks about that it's a partnership. It's a partnership that we internalize. And how do we internalize? Through the kav. So the yud above and the yud below, there's a line, the Yid Shamayim, that connects us both, takes Yiddishkeit, takes alakus, godliness, and Torah, and Yiddishkeit, and internalizes it in the most relevant and powerful way. And at the end of the day, people choose to do things that are relevant to them. If you gave someone right now 3 options, and they will choose the one that they find most relevant, even in Lahavdil, not in Kedusha, if they feel this book, or this song, or this experience is relevant to me, then you can talk to them about other things. They found their connection. So our challenge is to be the best product out there. That Torah should be the most relevant to you. And b'meila, automatically you'll gravitate to it, not just by force, but you'll want to gravitate because it's so deeply relevant and connected to who you are.
Okay, thank you very much. And this brings us to the 5th point, which is all about the concept of soulfulness and the idea of empathy and emotional intelligence and health. And as we would say in our parlance, it's all about the neshama. So can you please give us that glimpse into that?
Yeah. Of all the 5, this one is, I don't like to use the word the most entertaining, but it has a certain element of that. You know, there's a lot of talk today about emotional intelligence. We all know what intellectual intelligence are people who know how to play chess, who play mind games. They find excuses and rationale for anything. That's the mind. Emotional intelligence is a very different thing. It's knowing how to emote, how to empathize, how to feel for another. One of the most powerful things that you find in Chassidus that people don't realize until you pay attention is that Chassidus is a brilliant system. The deepest haskalas and ideas and philosophies, the highest levels of Seder Shtalshus, the Alter Rebbe, of course, Agoyin Shebege'enim, all the Rabbeim, powerful kol haskala, powerful ideas. But there's something even more powerful in Chassidus, and that is its empathy. The Alter Rebbe didn't just write Tanya to write a book of Ge'enis. If you read an introduction, why did he write Tanya? As a matter of fact, people misunderstand. Tanya, the Likutei Amorim, the first chelik, is not even a presentation of Chabad philosophy. Of course, it includes Chabad philosophy in it, and its basis and basics. But Alter Rebbe didn't write it to lay out Chabad Hashkofa. He wrote it as a Lekutei Eitzes. He said, because there wasn't time, there isn't any longer time to meet everybody, and people are coming with questions about their lives and their challenges. So I decided to put it all in the Sefer. And he elaborates that even though personal is better and more effective, but because we know each other, I put it into a Sefer. It's all about the Alter Rebbe's love and care for the Chassidim, that he wanted to take Chabad Chassidus and turn it into a working model that you can use it in your personal life. As we spoke about before, relevance. If you want Chabad, Hashkofas Chabad, obviously besides the parts in the Likutei Amorim, Shar Yichud V'Amuna is Hashkofa of Yichud, Achdus Hashem, Bitla Elamus. The Maimorim of Teireh, Likutei Teireh, he lays out Chabad Chassidus. Obviously also with personal application. But Likutei Amorim is saturated with only one thing, that I care about you, and I love you, and I will give you the best I have, to put it in very balbatish Asius, to help you live the best possible life as a good yid and connect to the Eibishter. Look, even the Nigan, it's saturated with the emotion. You hear the Rebbe, even that opening when he says, "Was is an Aleph?" A pintele for neben, you can hear the tear coming out. When the Alter Rebbe said it, the Nigan wasn't just, he's like to sing song. It demonstrated we're not just talking words, we're talking feelings. In Tovshin Daled, there's a Sikha where the Frierdiker Rebbe says the following, Pesach. It's amazing Sikha. Frierdiker Rebbe says that the Tzemach Tzedek had a chush ha-negina and a chush ha-tziyur, a chush ha-adinyan, which means he had a chush in singing and music, and he also had a chush in imagining. He had a beautiful, a very vivid imagination. Tzemach Tzedek then worked on it, he says, to try to eliminate his chushim because he felt it's a stira, a contradiction to learning Chassidus and to connecting to the Eibishter. That's what he thought. And then came the following story. The Alter Rebbe was already spreading out the manuscripts of Tanya a few years before it was printed. So it says the Chassidim were learning it, and they came to the Alter Rebbe. The Chassidim came to the Alter Rebbe after a year of learning these manuscripts. They said, we don't understand. The Alter Rebbe answered them, a halbe Zach nimmt man nicht. You don't take a half of thing. You only have half of the Tanya. What's the other half? Nigina, singing. Doesn't mean singing Tanya when you read it. It means nigina, the chusha nigina, that should be permeated with the emotion. Niginas and emotions, gaguyim. It's not just learning ideas. When the Tzemach Tzedek heard that, he had charota, that he tried to eliminate nigina. It doesn't talk about the dimyan part, nigina. I'm sure that Tzemach Tzedek, with all his work, he didn't get rid of his nigina regardless. But bottom line is, that's he's saying simfelta hal bezach. So what's Chassidus without the emotional connection and the empathy? And I say this, I mean, I'll speak on a personal note. I went to the yeshiva system. We learned Gemara, we learned Nigla, we learned Chassidus. I have to say, without names, so there's no Lashon Hara, it was not presented, we'll put it this way, in an empathetic way. It was not presented in an emotional way. It was presented as ideas. Once you discover that it's really about emotional intelligence, not just intellectual intelligence, it changes everything. I don't know who coined this line, but it's a very powerful line that you can use. When you keep this in mind, it'll change how you do your classes, whatever classes you teach. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You can have a brilliant speaker and a brilliant teacher and espousing all kinds of powerful ideas, but if the audience doesn't feel they don't feel he cares or she cares, you're going to lose your audience. Now, yes, if they're giving you real estate tips or how to cook, you don't really care about their empathy. But if they're talking to you about life, about challenges, about joys and pains, about purpose, about everything that we try to teach our students, how to live your life, no, that doesn't go that way. Care. Everyone who met the Rebbe, what do they say about the Rebbe? He looked at me as if no one else was there. He cared. Now, of course, care together with the learning is what changes. We're not just talking empathy without teichen, without content, but content with empathy changes the whole picture. Sadly, I'm not sure if this is a true stereotype or not, but they say women have natural emotional intelligence more than men. Bini Yisei Be'isha, they have certain natural nurturing skills. Men sometimes can be very abstract and detached. Since I'm a man, I could say it's true to some extent, but that doesn't mean all men are lost. It means they can be taught. Remember, Chassidus was not just for women, it's also for men. But the Rebbe did say in a number of sikhs that Chassidus is for everyone equally, because it talks about the Sheshari Mikla, the 6 mitzvahs Tmidius, Nadzman Grama, Avos Hashem, Yiras Hashem, Amunah, and so on, which is shaykh to everyone. And the Rebbe would add from time to time, Unoshim, Ubonis, women and girls, in some ways can appreciate Chassidus even more than men. I could tell you as a chayzer and a publisher of the Rebbe's words, the sikhs the Rebbe spoke to the women, which was usually 3 times a year, right before Rosh Hashanah, right before around Shavuos time to the Kinus, the Shei B'nai Chabad, and then to the graduates and to those going to camps, 3 times a year. There was once a 4th time that Rebbe spoke once Mitzvah Shabbos Bereish Islam and Hey when he came out with Miftzah Neshek. There were exceptions, and of course the Yechidus Klalius later, obviously, were also for women. So, but the Rebbe, those sikhs, some of the deepest concepts in Chassidus, the Rebbe spoke in those sikhs, particularly to women. Now, when you read it, it sounds like deceptively simple sometimes. But I can tell you, I can show you that some of the deepest ideas of Chassidus, the Rebbe was malbishit. He put it into words in ways that are easy to understand. But he spoke, so I always wondered, why was that? I have no doubt because Chassidus is not just intellectual ideas. Not to suggest, God forbid, that a woman doesn't have the powerful intellect. But what you really need to appreciate Chassidus is the emotional dimension. How do you apply it? You learn a Maimon of Chassidus. Will it help you educate your son and daughter? Many people say, I don't know. I don't know how to connect Elam Atzilis or Eris and Kalim or the Tzimtzum or the Kav or Toyu and Tikkun, or whatever the Sugi and Chassidus is. What does it have to do with my life? So in addition to relevance, it's also has emotional implications. That's what's called Aveda. I saw Yechidus, Rabbi David Askin Olav Shalom, big Askin head of Tzach, and now one of the faculty in the yeshiva, in Tovshin Yud, Tammuz Tovshin Yud. Literally, we're talking about the first year. He went into Yechidus to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says to him, and not only that, he wrote down the Yechidus afterwards. The Rebbe edited it. He asked 2 questions, among other things, but the 2 I'm going to focus on. One was, you learn Chassidus and you don't see it has an impact on you. What do you do about that? The second question is, how do you learn a Maimer properly? So the Rebbe answered the first question and said, learning Chassidus and you don't feel it has an impact is like you're walking in the sunlight in a bright day and your eyes are closed. The sun is impacting you. You're just not seeing it. That was the first answer that Rebbe gave. Regarding how to learn a Maimer, the Rebbe said, every time you finish a chapter in a Maimer, you have to have a bechein. What does it mean to your life, your personal life? And the Rebbe gave an example. He said, the idea in the Maimer is thick, but when you want to pierce through a cloth or through anything, you can't use a thick thumb or a thick object. You need a very thin and fine needle. And that's the bechein, the personal and the emotional connection to it. Once you have that in addition to the relevance, then you have a full picture. So Chassidus came to create and shape not just minds, but also hearts. How you get to love and emotions, you need the mind to direct, to guide, to create the objective reflection that leads you, because you don't want to follow your emotional impulses. You want them to be guided, but it all has to come down to an emotional connection. This is vital. I don't think I even have to tell it to you. I'm sure any one of you teaching a class are not just sitting there and reading dry text. You are making it come alive, but bring yourself into the picture. Many people ask me whether they should be personal. Absolutely. There's nothing like people relating to you, relating to the subject matter. If you can say, here we're learning now a certain text, or a certain mimer, or a certain whatever it may be, a pasuk even, and you can bring in a story how that pasuk or that idea affected your life personally and emotionally, it changes the whole class because they can identify with you. Many think we have to remain above. Yes, of course, you're the teacher, you're not them. But still, that identification creates the empathy. And especially when you're dealing with sensitive subjects, things like pain and suffering, to preach and tell people what to do is not going to be resonant. For them to resonate with them is when they feel that you are with them. I remember when the Rebbe would speak, especially coming from Chav Bei Shvat, how he spoke about the Rebbetzin. It was personal. The Rebbe cried in Fabrengens, and he showed that the emotions in it. It wasn't just, we're detached and aloof. That emotional impact changes the whole picture. And finally, going back to the Niggin, we know the Alter Rebbe was in Shklov, was a big city of Ge'enim and Lomdim and Litvishich G'delim. The Alter Rebbe gave a drasha, a feierdige drasha. And people were taken by it. But the Alter Rebbe felt, it was not. So the Alter Rebbe then sang the Niggin. The famous Niggin, the Rebbe sang it as well, Purim Tavshin Chai. Said, Tamaru kitei vavaye, versuchten zet, as the Rebbe is good. And with that Niggin, it says hundreds of people streamed out of Shklov following him. Because together with the scholarship, the Niggin was what got it. The Niggin. Avedas HaTfilah is Avedas Shebelev. Avedas HaTeira, Limud HaTeira is Avedas Shebemeach. Avedas Shebelev, the heart, the emotions. And that emotion comes down to emotional intelligence, emotional application, and above all, empathy. You care about the person you're teaching. You're not just teaching them, you care about them. And Kamayim Aponim Laponim, when you care, people will care about you and what you're teaching as well. It's like a mirror reflection in the water. So that's principle number 5.
Okay. Thank you so much. And right before we get ready to wrap up the session, I know that there are some comments, and we don't really have time to answer them now, but we have them all, and we will, in Mirza Hashem, respond to everything. I would also like to ask my husband if people would have questions, if they would be able to contact you and you would be able to respond. Is it okay if we put your email address out there?
Absolutely.
Okay, so if we could, Hanel, if you're still there, if you could type into the chat, it's Simon, SIMON, at meaningfullife.com. Meaningful Life is one word and it has 2 L's, Meaningful Life. So Simon at meaningfullife.com, and he'll be happy to respond. I don't know if it'll happen in a day, but it will certainly happen in the next few days, Emirza Hashem. So thank you so much for that. And I just would like to wrap up by sharing the following with you. This is something that I witnessed myself many, many years ago, but I'm still very connected to this person till today, and also now to her children. This is something that I think really encompasses these 5 points. And I'm sorry that, we didn't maybe act upon all these points at the right time, but you could see that as we give classes to people, and even as they get older and older, this will always remain not only important, but it will remain paramount and in the front of our success. So very, very briefly, when I was teaching in high school and then in seminary, but in high school for many, many years, and to make a long story short, there was a particular girl who was an excellent student in the English department, but she was a very officially poor student in the Hebrew department. And she was constantly looking for ways, it was obvious, to get out of class during the Hebrew studies. And somebody in school asked me if I could speak with her and figure out what the problem was. Anyway, I'm not going to go through all the details because it does not really matter. To make a long story short, one day I tried to become friendly with her and I tried to figure out how to connect her because I was actually not her teacher. And basically I asked around and somebody told me that she likes to babysit. So the next time I had guests who needed a babysitter, we were all going out to a simcha. I asked her if she would babysit. She said yes. And then I had her in my house a couple of times. I became very connected to her. And I started to ask her why she really does not like the Hebrew subjects. And she really would give me all kinds of runaround answers. I felt that there was something wrong, but I could not figure out what it was. Anyway, one time she came to babysit in my house, and I still remember this as if it was yesterday. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but yes, we used to, for many years, receive the New York Times to our home, even though, of course, we stopped. And if you remember, there was a section on Tuesdays, which was called Health and Science. And that's how I remember that the day she came to babysit that evening, it was a Tuesday. Because the next day when I came to school, she said to me, I must speak with you, Mrs. Jacobson. I said, okay. And I spoke with her during lunchtime, and she told me the following. She said, I was in your house yesterday, and there was a newspaper on the table, and I saw something in the newspaper, and I want you to know that I have a very, very terrible disease. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, I can't tell you, but I know I have a disease, and I don't know what to do about it. I can't tell anybody. I said, okay, don't tell me the name of the disease. Could you tell me the symptoms? And she said to me, okay. And she started enumerating the symptoms. And the symptoms were things like, don't want to get out of bed and have no appetite and don't care, feel sad and all kinds of things like that. And I realized that she read an article in there that described depression. And I said to her, do you think you're depressed? And she burst out crying and she said, yes. And I said, don't worry, we could help you. And she said, no, I don't want my parents to know I'm the one child in the family that I'm just not like everybody else. I'm not a good student. I'm not this, I'm not that. I could never tell my parents about this. Anyway, I'm not going to go through the details, but I figured out together with Mrs. Tachtel how to, and somebody that I worked for, I would say his name, and he should be a good and better for all of us because he gave his heart and soul to help so many people. Michal Bierman, Olav HaShalom, who I was working with at the time. And I figured out, he gave me some ways to get around this whole way of having parental control. And I went with her to see a psychologist. And the bottom line was the psychologist said that she's not clinically depressed, but she basically, there is a problem. Eventually we'll get to it. She's going to have to come to a place where she'll be able to speak about it. Anyway, I should just be nice to her, etc. And I was very, very good friends with her. And again, I don't want to go through all the details, but the bottom line is I went away one summer and I convinced her to go to a camp, and she only would go if she would be a mother's helper. She refused to be a counselor or anything like that. And that summer she called me up and she said, when I come home, I must speak with you. And this is what she said to me. And here you see the power of was is an Aleph, because it goes through every single part of our educational system and does not stop when we become adults. She finally admitted to me and she burst out crying and she said, I want you to know why I am so good in English and so terrible in Hebrew. It is because I never learned how to read Hebrew properly. And so when a teacher once called on me to read a pasuk and I said no, she told me, leave the room. And therefore I would make it my business never to be called upon. And if I was afraid that somebody would call on me, I would make some trouble so I could get kicked out of class. And I want you to know that's why I didn't want to be a counselor. I was terrified I would be asked to give a shiur, would ask to learn with the kids to daven. And so therefore, everything I know from Baal Peh. I know by heart. So I want you to know that I am the biggest failure in the world. And I said to her, it's not true. You could learn how to read, etc., etc. But what I really want to tell you is the following. And these are the words that she said to me. She said to me, I want you to know that until somebody realized that I was not just going to have to learn how to read Hebrew, because you have to learn the mechanics. You have to learn Kametz Aleph and then you have to learn how to connect the two letters and the sentences and everything else. Until somebody would finally understand that this was something that I had to really internalize, and somebody would understand that it's my soul and that it's the entire big picture of my life and everything else, and somebody would take the time of day to see that I am a human being, that I have all of these kashreinas, but I just have to have some help with it, I knew nothing could help. Well, I want to tell you, ladies, there was a wonderful woman in Crown Heights, then Aleha Shalom now, Mrs. Luba Friedman, who I went with this girl to her. We put together some money, and she taught her how to learn how to read Hebrew properly. She came to seminary. I used to sit with this girl once a week after school with a sitter and a pencil, and we would go through exactly inside where you say what, how you say everything, etc., etc. I want to tell you, till today, I am good friends with this woman. She has children, already adults, Baruch Hashem. Sometimes she calls me to help me, to ask me to help her with her children's homework. And this is all because this was what Chassidus taught us. You cannot just teach somebody the physical Aleph. It's very important, but we have to give them the soul of it. So thank you, everybody who joined us today. There is nobody in the world like you, Shluchais, who don't only give the Aleph and the Beis and the Gimel and all the Psukim. You give everything of yourselves. You give your neshama, and that is why you are Matzliach. So I want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you to everybody who helped us put this together. A huge thank you to Hannah Ledefter, who is an amazing, amazing assistant and project manager and my right hand. Thank you to her. And a special thank you to the Kinus Hashluchais organizers for giving us this fantastic opportunity to be together, to learn. Nothing stops us, not COVID, nothing else. We will continue until the coming of Mashiach. Thank you, Simon, very much for joining us. And thank you, everybody, where we only share good news. B'Sedes Tavis, may the banquet this afternoon take place in Yerushalayim. Thank you all.